A millionaire was forced by his father to marry a disabled pianist. A few months later, he came to the company and did something that left everyone, including his father, gaping. The warm hum of conversation filled the hall, punctuated by the clinking of silverware against plates and the occasional burst of laughter. Soft lighting bathed the room in a golden glow, casting elongated shadows on the polished floors. It was an event Richard Stark had attended countless times before, an evening of fine dining and philanthropy, where New York's elite gathered under the noble guise of charity. He had always believed in giving back, though few of his peers truly understood why. To them, charity was a footnote, a tax-deductible gesture, an opportunity to rub shoulders with influencers and business moguls. But Richard knew better. The real value of these events wasn't found in the extravagant donations or the luxury silent auctions. It was in the faces of those who received, the people whose lives were changed, even if only for a fleeting moment. Tonight, however, something felt different. As he moved past the sea of tailored suits and diamond-studded gowns, his attention caught on something unexpected, a melody, delicate yet unwavering, weaving through the din of voices. It wasn't the grandiose performance of a seasoned musician demanding attention. Rather, it was something pure, something unpolished, yet deeply felt. His eyes followed the sound to the small stage in the corner of the room. A young woman sat at an upright piano, her fingers gliding over the worn keys, moving with an instinct that spoke of years spent in silent devotion. Her eyes remained closed, her head tilting slightly, as if listening, not to the notes, but to something deeper, something beyond sound. Richard paused, curiosity prickling at the back of his mind. The song was familiar, a classical piece most musicians approached with technical precision. Yet, there was something in the way she played, something profoundly different. It was as if she wasn't playing to impress, but rather to speak, through vibrations, through touch, through the memory of what music had once meant to her. And then, as he observed more closely, the realization settled in. She wasn't reacting to the shifting sounds of the room, to the applause that trickled in from a few appreciative listeners. She hadn't lifted her gaze to acknowledge those who had gathered around. She wasn't hearing the music at all. A woman beside him leaned in, noticing his intrigue. "That's Isabella," she murmured. "She's deaf, you know. And mute." Richard turned his gaze back to the pianist. Deaf. The word sat strangely on his tongue. He had met people with hearing impairments before, but never had he seen someone like this, a woman so deeply immersed in a world she could not hear. Yet somehow, she felt it all. His interest deepened as he continued watching her. When she finished playing, she lifted her hands off the keys and let them hover for a brief second, before slowly lowering them to her lap. There was no expectation of applause, no basking in the attention that performers so often sought. Instead, she simply smiled, a quiet, knowing smile, and rose from the bench. The children sitting near the stage scrambled toward her, small hands tugging at her sleeves, their faces lit with joy. She responded with soft gestures, signing with an effortless grace that even Richard, with his limited understanding of sign language, could recognize as affectionate. A little girl handed her a crumpled napkin with something scribbled on it. Isabella took it with gentle hands, read it, and laughed, a soundless laugh that barely moved her lips, but shone in her eyes. Richard exhaled slowly, something shifting inside him. He had come tonight expecting the usual, donations, networking, the mechanical exchange of pleasantries. But now, watching Isabella, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Respect. She wasn't someone who pitied herself, nor was she someone who needed saving. She existed fully in her own world, moving through it with quiet resilience, leaving behind warmth in places others might overlook. And yet, she was here, giving when she had so little, sharing what many took for granted. A thought took root, unshaken by the cynicism that often followed his impulses. Lucas. His son, who had never learned to look beyond himself, spent his life taking without truly knowing what it meant to give. His son, who despite all his brilliance, had never once understood that power was more than just wealth and status. Could someone like Isabella change him? Could someone so unlike him, someone who navigated the world through touch and sight, rather than words and sound, make Lucas see what Richard had failed to teach? The idea was absurd, but then again, wasn't change always born from the unexpected? As Isabella crouched down to ruffle a young boy's hair, her laughter was silent, yet full of light. Richard made a decision. Perhaps this was fate, or perhaps it was simply a rare moment of clarity. Either way, he wasn't about to ignore it. The cafe smelled of roasted coffee beans and freshly baked bread, a warmth contrasting with the cold drizzle tapping against the windows. It was small and unassuming, the kind of place where people took their time, where conversations drifted softly over the hum of jazz playing from an old speaker in the corner. Isabella sat at a table near the back, hands resting on her lap, eyes scanning the page of an open notebook. She wasn't writing, just tracing the grooves of previous notes with her fingertips, lost in thought. The man sitting across from her had barely spoken since she arrived. Richard Stark. She had seen him before, at the charity gala, watching her with quiet intensity, as if trying to understand something unspoken. Now, here he was, dressed in a dark, well-tailored suit, his presence a stark contrast to the easy air of the cafe. He was composed, unreadable, fingers wrapped loosely around a ceramic coffee cup he hadn't touched. Isabella lifted her gaze to meet his. He was waiting for something, her attention, perhaps her patience. So she tilted her head slightly, silently prompting him to begin. Richard exhaled through his nose, setting his cup down. "I imagine you're wondering why I asked you here." She nodded. He hesitated only briefly before reaching into his briefcase and pulling out a sleek, leather-bound folder. He placed it between them, fingertips drumming lightly on the surface, before he pushed it toward her. She hesitated. Then carefully, she opened it. The words stared back at her, sharp and unmistakable. Marriage contract. Her fingers twitched. She looked up at him, brow furrowing, waiting. Richard met her gaze evenly. "I want you to marry my son, Lucas." Isabella blinked. For a moment, she wasn't sure if she had read the words correctly. Her hands curled around the edge of the folder, knuckles whitening slightly. She didn't move, didn't react, just waited for him to explain. Richard leaned forward, his voice steady. 1 year, a contractual marriage. In return, I will fund your tuition, every cent, for you to study at the Paris Music Academy. Her pulse fluttered, but she kept her face neutral. Paris. She had spent years dreaming of walking through the grand halls of that academy, feeling the vibrations of centuries-old pianos beneath her fingertips. It wasn't just about prestige, it was about access. Access to professors who understood music beyond the limits of sound. Access to compositions she could only read about. Access to the kind of education that wasn't possible for someone like her. And yet, this. She lifted her pen and wrote on a napkin. Why? Richard's expression didn't shift. Lucas is stuck, lost in his own world. He has power, money, and intelligence. But he doesn't understand people, doesn't understand what it means to listen. He needs someone who can teach him that. She considered this. Then slowly, she wrote again. And you think I can? Richard exhaled, a faint smirk appearing as he shook his head. I don't know, but I know he won't change on his own. She tapped the tip of her pen against the paper, thoughtful. You believe he can change? A pause. Then Richard nodded. She leaned back, absorbing it all. A marriage of convenience, a deal, a transaction. But something in Richard's demeanor told her that, despite the clinical approach, he cared. not just about his son's wealth or reputation, but about him. Still, Lucas Stark was a name she knew, even if she had never met him. She had read about him in passing. A billionaire's son, an heir groomed for success, a man who lived in excess and seemed to care for little beyond his own world. She could only imagine what he would think of this arrangement. She picked up the napkin again, writing the words deliberately. What if he refuses? Richard's lips pressed into a thin line. Then he will no longer be my heir. Isabella stilled. For the first time since she had sat down, she felt something other than curiosity creeping in. This wasn't just a desperate father trying to tame an unruly son. This was an ultimatum, one that Richard had no intention of withdrawing. She exhaled slowly. 1 year. 1 year of enduring a stranger, of being part of a life she had no interest in, of walking into something that would change everything. But also, 1 year in exchange for a future she had never dared to hope for. She lifted her pen and with steady fingers wrote 2 words. I accept. Meanwhile, across town. Lucas Stark stared at his father from across his penthouse living room, barely restraining his anger. His fingers curled into fists at his sides, his jaw tightening. You expect me to do what? His voice was sharp, cutting through the tension like glass. Richard remained impassive, sitting calmly in the leather armchair. Marry her. For 1 year, Lucas let out a short, humorless laugh, running a hand through his hair. And if I don't? Richard's answer was swift. Then you lose everything. Lucas scoffed, pacing to the floor-to-ceiling windows, his reflection barely visible against the city lights. This is insane, he muttered. You think I'll just… What? Play house with some girl I've never met? Some… He stopped himself, turning back. Who even is she? Richard met his gaze. Her name is Isabella. She's a pianist. Deaf. Mute. Lucas's brows lifted in something between disbelief and exasperation. You're setting me up with someone who can't even talk to me. Richard's gaze hardened. You've never listened to anyone a day in your life. Maybe it's time you learned how. Silence stretched between them. Lucas's hands flexed at his sides, a muscle ticking in his jaw. Everything. That was what was at stake. His company, his assets, the empire he had spent his life securing. His name, his status. Gone, if he said no. He took a slow breath, forcing his emotions into something contained, something palatable. Then, reluctantly, he walked toward the table where the contract lay open. His father didn't gloat, didn't even look satisfied, just expectant, as if this outcome had been inevitable. Lucas reached for the pen, a scratch of ink against paper. His name, now tied to hers. A deal that neither of them could walk away from. The ceremony was a formality, nothing more. Under the grand chandeliers of an opulent hotel ballroom, Lucas Stark stood beside Isabella, hands tucked in his pockets, expression unreadable. His suit was tailored to perfection, his posture effortless, as if he were merely attending another business event. Isabella, dressed in a simple yet elegant white gown, stood still beside him, her expression calm, detached. She had never dreamt of a wedding, let alone one like this, one void of love, filled only with obligation. They barely looked at each other as the officiant read through the vows. Lucas's voice was flat when he muttered his, "I do." Isabella only nodded when it was her turn. There was no joy, no warmth, only the rustling of expensive fabrics and the weight of expectation pressing down on them. Richard Stark stood among the select guests, watching them with quiet intensity, his hands clasped together, his gaze steady. He was the only one who seemed to believe, who hoped that something real could emerge from this cold transaction. But Lucas had already moved on. That night at the reception, he sat at the bar, laughing a little too loudly with a supermodel draped over his arm. A famous actress whispered in his ear, her manicured nails tracing the edge of his sleeve. He didn't care that his new wife was seated just across the room. that she could see him, because she wouldn't hear a thing, and as far as he was concerned, she wouldn't care either. The penthouse was cold, not in temperature, but in presence. The space was vast, decorated in sleek greys and blacks, all sharp edges and modern minimalism. The air smelled faintly of expensive cologne and the polished wood of untouched furniture. Large floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across the main living area, revealing a stunning view of New York City at night. A city full of life, full of noise. But inside these walls, there was nothing. No warmth, no welcome. Isabella stepped inside, suitcase in hand, her fingers tightening slightly around the handle. She had expected this. She hadn't expected much else from him, the man who had agreed to this arrangement with all the enthusiasm of someone signing away their last breath. Lucas Stark stood across the room, one hand in his pocket, the other swirling a crystal glass of whiskey. He didn't speak, didn't look up from whatever thoughts occupied him. His jaw was tight, his expression unreadable. A silent war had already begun. She let out a slow breath, lowering her suitcase beside the couch. When she straightened, she lifted her chin, waiting. Lucas took his time setting down his drink before finally regarding her with the cool indifference of a man who had just been inconvenienced. "Bedrooms down the hall, first door on the right," he said flatly. Isabella nodded once in understanding. She didn't ask for a tour, didn't ask where she was allowed to go. She already knew he didn't want her here, and she had no intention of forcing her presence where it wasn't welcome. Lucas watched her for a second longer, as if expecting something from her, an argument, a plea, a sign of weakness. When he didn't get it, he scoffed under his breath, shaking his head before turning away. So be it. The days passed in suffocating silence. Lucas didn't acknowledge her. Not in the mornings when they passed in the hallway, not in the evenings when they shared the same space. Isabella went about her life as she always had, practicing, reading, writing, but never trying to engage with him, and that infuriated him. At first, he had expected resistance, expected her to try to insert herself into his life like some desperate intruder. But she didn't. She acted as though he didn't exist, the same way he was trying to do with her. And somehow, that made it worse. Small provocations started. Lucas blasted music through the penthouse speakers, the bass vibrating the walls, testing her reaction. But Isabella simply turned another page of her book, unaffected. He slammed doors, deliberately loud, just to see if she would flinch. But she didn't even blink. The silence between them was no longer something he was imposing. It was hers. And he hated that it wasn't something he could control. She, on the other hand, went about her life in quiet defiance. Isabella cooked her own meals, washed her own dishes, and cleaned her space without complaint. She never disturbed him, never asked for anything, and never demanded more than what this arrangement was meant to be. And that was the most infuriating thing of all. Lucas had lived his entire life being catered to, being chased, being the center of attention. Women hung onto his words, desperate for his approval. His business partners, his employees, even his so-called friends, everyone wanted something from him. But Isabella wanted nothing, and it left him restless in a way he couldn't explain. One evening, after another meaningless night spent drinking and entertaining himself in places that didn't really matter, Lucas came home late. The penthouse was dim, save for the soft glow of a single lamp near the piano. At first, he didn't think anything of it, until he heard it. Not noise, not sound, something else. The room wasn't filled with music, at least not in the way he was used to. It wasn't performed, wasn't forced. It was felt. Isabella sat at the piano, fingers gliding over the keys, her body swaying ever so slightly with each note. She played with pure emotion, eyes closed, a soft, serene expression resting on her face. Lucas stopped in the doorway. For the first time, He wasn't looking at her as the woman his father had forced into his life. He wasn't looking at her as an obligation, a contract, or an inconvenience. He was just watching. The way her hands moved, graceful, precise, but also searching. Like she wasn't just playing music, she was feeling it. He had never seen someone play like that before. Music to him had always been just sound, a thing you put on in the background, a thing you consumed but never really thought about. But Isabella, she played like it was the only language she had left. And somehow, despite the silence of the room, Lucas heard her. He didn't realize he was holding his breath until she lifted her hands from the keys, the last note fading into the stillness. For a moment, she simply sat there, eyes still closed, her fingers resting lightly on the piano's surface as if she could still feel the vibrations. Then she opened her eyes and saw him. Lucas tensed, his expression shifting back into something neutral, distant. He expected her to react, to look startled, maybe embarrassed, but she only regarded him calmly. She didn't rush to explain herself, didn't apologize for taking up space in his home, in his silence. She just waited. And for once, Lucas had nothing to say. Lucas didn't think much of it at first. After that night, after seeing Isabella play in a way that defied logic, he had convinced himself it was a passing thought, an anomaly in an otherwise predictable existence. He had spent so much time ignoring her, dismissing her as background noise, that he assumed he could simply push whatever that feeling was aside. But it lingered. She lingered. In the mornings, he started noticing her small habits, the way she held her coffee cup with both hands, as if absorbing its warmth, the way she paused before turning a page of her book, as though savoring the silence between words, the way she studied people's faces, not with detached curiosity, but with something more profound, something searching. She wasn't quiet because she had no choice. She was quiet because she understood something Lucas didn't, and that annoyed the hell out of him. One morning, he came into the kitchen, still groggy from sleep, and reached for the coffee machine. His movements were automatic, pour, sip, grimace at the bitterness. It was a routine as familiar as breathing. But today, something was different. A note sat beside his cup, written in neat, slanted handwriting. "Don't let the bitterness ruin the taste." Lucas stared at it. His first instinct was irritation. Was this some kind of subtle critique? Some quiet jab at his personality? He snatched the note off the counter, his jaw tightening. But even as he crumpled it in his fist, the words stayed with him. Later that night, as he worked in his office, a fresh cup of coffee sat beside him, untouched. For reasons he couldn't explain, he reached for a sugar packet and slowly emptied it in. It was the first time in years that he drank his coffee differently. Days passed, and the tension between them remained the same, silent, unspoken, a push and pull that neither acknowledged. But Lucas kept watching. He told himself it was curiosity, nothing more. He noticed how she moved without hesitation, how she seemed to anticipate things before they happened, how she could tell when someone was about to speak, even before they opened their mouth. One evening, he decided to test it. He walked into the kitchen while she was washing dishes, his footsteps deliberately light against the marble floor. No reaction. He stepped closer, waiting to see if she would sense him. But then, without turning around, without pausing in her movements, she reached for another glass and held it out to him. Lucas froze. It was effortless, like she had always known he was there, like she had felt the shift in the air, the way his presence changed the space around her. His fingers hovered over the glass for a beat too long before he took it. Isabella didn't look at him. She didn't need to. That night, long after she had gone to bed, Lucas made a decision. He wanted to understand. So he turned off his phone, dimmed the lights, and closed his eyes. And then he tried to navigate the world the way she did. At first it was easy. The penthouse was familiar, its layout engraved in his memory. But then he started moving. He reached for his glass of whiskey on the counter and knocked it over, the ice clinking loudly against the floor. He cursed under his breath, fumbling in the dark, his hand finding the wet mess too late. He moved toward the living room, confident in his steps, until he misjudged the edge of the coffee table, pain shooting up his shin. He stumbled, gripping the couch to steady himself. 5 minutes. That's all it took for frustration to set in. Lucas sank onto the couch, rubbing his temples. How did she do this? How did she move through life with such certainty, such grace? While he, a man who had spent years controlling every aspect of his world, felt utterly lost the moment he was deprived of the senses he took for granted. For the first time since this marriage began, Lucas Stark felt something unexpected, respect, and it unsettled him more than anything else. The silence between them had become something different. It was no longer a wall Lucas had built to keep Isabella out, nor was it the quiet defiance she had wrapped herself in. It had changed, shifted into something he couldn't quite name. It was awareness. He caught himself watching her more often now, not out of irritation, not out of obligation, just curiosity. He had spent his life in rooms filled with noise, where people talked over one another, where words were weapons and shields. But Isabella existed in a world that didn't rely on any of that, and somehow she didn't seem less because of it. One evening, after finishing his usual calls, he glanced toward the couch where Isabella sat, legs tucked beneath her, reading. The soft glow of the lamp highlighted the curve of her cheek, the way her lips moved faintly as she read the words on the page. He didn't know why it fascinated him, this quiet world she inhabited, but it did. Lucas picked up a pen. For a moment, he hesitated, tapping the end of it against the marble countertop. Then, before he could second-guess himself, he reached for a piece of paper and wrote, "Do you ever wish you could hear?" He placed it on the table beside her before walking away, retreating to the kitchen. It wasn't until he was pouring himself a drink that he felt her presence behind him. When he turned, she was holding the note. She didn't look surprised, nor did she seem offended. Instead, a small, knowing smile curved the corners of her mouth. She reached for the pen beside his glass, flipped the paper over, and wrote something before sliding it back to him. Lucas frowned, glancing down. "Do you ever wish you could listen?" His grip tightened around the paper. For a long moment, he just stood there, staring at the words. They were simple, but they weren't simple at all. She was challenging him, he realized. Not in a confrontational way, but in a way that forced him to look inward, to acknowledge something he had spent his entire life ignoring. Lucas let out a quiet breath and shook his head. Without another word, he placed the note on the counter and walked away. But the question stayed with him. After that, they began communicating through notes. At first, it was sporadic, short, practical exchanges left in passing. "I'll be out late tonight. Your lawyer sent over some documents. There's extra food in the fridge." But soon, the messages changed, became something more. One morning, he found a note stuck to the espresso machine. "If you drink so much coffee, how do you ever sleep?" Later that day, he scribbled back, "If I stopped, how would I survive my board meetings?" Isabella's reply came the next morning, written on a napkin by his plate. "You'd survive. You just wouldn't enjoy it as much." Lucas found himself waiting for the notes, searching for them. And for reasons he didn't fully understand, he started writing back more than he needed to. It was easy, easier than speaking. And for once, there was no expectation, no performance, just words, unfiltered. One evening, Lucas returned home later than usual. The penthouse was dim, the city lights beyond the windows stretching endlessly into the dark. He loosened his tie as he stepped inside, exhaling a breath that felt heavier than usual. Then he heard it. Software, barely there. A melody, delicate and slow, is drifting from the living room. Lucas stilled. Isabella was at the piano again, fingers moving across the keys with a tenderness he didn't understand. The room was quiet, yet somehow full. She wasn't just playing, she was speaking. His throat tightened unexpectedly. For the first time, Lucas didn't just hear the music, he felt it. He stood there, watching her, not wanting to interrupt. But Isabella must have sensed him, because she lifted her head, her gaze meeting his across the room. Lucas braced himself for something. Acknowledgement, hesitation, maybe even irritation. But she simply offered him the smallest, quietest smile. And for the first time, Lucas smiled back. Lucas wasn't sure when the frustration began. It wasn't the kind that came from annoyance. The way he had felt when Isabella first moved in, when she ignored his presence as effortlessly as he ignored hers. It wasn't anger either. It was something deeper, something uncomfortable. Because now, he wanted to understand. That realization irritated him. He had always been the smartest in the room, the one who had control, who dictated the terms. But here, in this strange, quiet world Isabella existed in, he felt lost, and he hated feeling lost. Which was how he found himself sitting in a cramped classroom, sandwiched between an elderly man struggling to sign the alphabet and a teenager with a notebook filled with careful, neat handwriting. Lucas had enrolled in a sign language course. It had been a split-second decision, something he did without thinking too much about it. If he had overanalyzed, he would have found every reason not to do it. But now that he was here, sitting stiffly in a circle of strangers, watching the instructor's hands move with fluid precision, he realized something. This was harder than he thought. The motions felt unnatural at first, his fingers slow, hesitant. He wasn't used to communicating without words, wasn't used to thinking in silence. The first lesson was simple. Introductions. But even that felt like a challenge. When it was his turn, he struggled, his movements awkward. The instructor corrected him with patience, showing him the right gestures. Lucas gritted his teeth, adjusted his hands, and tried again. He had never failed at something so basic before, but he kept coming back. Because every time he sat in that class, every time he practiced the movements, he started seeing the world differently. It wasn't just about words. It was about expression, about intention. And more than that, he started seeing Isabella differently. She continued her work at the local charity center as if their quiet understanding hadn't shifted something between them. Lucas hadn't asked about it, but one morning, as she was preparing to leave, she paused by the door and looked at him. Then, in slow, deliberate gestures, she signed, "Come with me." Lucas hesitated. He didn't know why. Maybe because this wasn't part of the contract. Maybe because it was easier to keep their lives separate, to pretend they weren't inching toward something unfamiliar. But Isabella just waited, patient as always. And somehow, that was what made him say yes. The charity center was nothing like the places Lucas was used to. It wasn't sleek or modern, and it wasn't filled with people wearing designer suits and expensive perfume. It was real, a small, bustling space where volunteers moved with quiet efficiency, where people weren't concerned with appearances, but with helping. Lucas felt out of place immediately. He had never belonged in places like this. He bought charity and donated absurd amounts of money to foundations his assistant selected. But this, being here, seeing it firsthand, that was different. And then he saw her. Isabella was across the room, kneeling beside a young boy who couldn't have been more than 10. The boy looked hesitant, unsure, his small hands resting on a battered keyboard. She reached out and placed his hand over the piano's surface. Then she pressed a key. The boy blinked. She pressed another. Lucas realized what she was doing. The boy couldn't hear the notes, but he could feel the vibrations. Isabella was teaching him to experience music the same way she did. Lucas swallowed hard, because in that moment, she didn't look like a woman confined by silence. She looked free. He continued watching as she moved through the room, singing with the elderly, laughing with the children, placing a gentle hand on someone's shoulder in quiet reassurance. She belonged here in a way he never had, in a way he wasn't sure he ever could, and for the first time in his life, Lucas Stark felt small. They walked home in silence. Not the uncomfortable kind. Not anymore. The city lights flickered around them, taxis rushing past, the sounds of distant sirens threading through the air. Lucas kept his hands in his pockets, his mind still replaying the afternoon. The children, the way Isabella had smiled so openly, the way she didn't need words to be understood. And then, before he could talk himself out of it, he lifted his hands. Slowly, awkwardly, he signed his first word to her. "Thank you." Isabella stopped walking. Lucas shifted uncomfortably, unsure if he had done it right. But then, she turned to him, her expression unreadable. And then, for the first time since they met, she truly smiled. Not the polite, distant smiles she had given before. A real one. And Lucas felt something shift again, something irreversible. That morning, Lucas stood at the head of the conference table, flipping through the quarterly report with sharp, calculated precision. The room was silent, tension thick in the air. His team sat stiffly, waiting, expecting the usual. Then he found it. A mistake. A glaring error in the financial projections, the kind that would have earned someone a severe reprimand just months ago. His eyes flicked up to the young analyst responsible, Mark, a junior employee who had only recently joined the firm. Mark paled, gripping the edge of his chair as if bracing for impact. Others shifted uncomfortably, exchanging wary glances. They had seen Lucas tear people apart for less. But today, something was different. Lucas set the report down. He exhaled quietly. Then, in an even tone, said, "You made a mistake." Mark swallowed hard. I know, sir, Fix it," Lucas interrupted. But there was no bite in his voice. No sharp edge, just instruction. "Run it by your department head and offer him help. Make sure it doesn't happen again." Mark blinked. So did the others. No shouting, no humiliation. The room held its breath. Then finally, Mark nodded. Yes, sir. I'll correct it immediately." Lucas gave a curt nod. "Good." The meeting continued. Richard Stark watched from his office window, arms crossed. When the boardroom emptied, he stepped inside. "You're changing," he said simply. Lucas glanced up, brow furrowed. "What?" Richard smiled, eyes knowing. 5 months ago, that kid wouldn't have made it out of this room without questioning his career choices. Lucas scoffed, shaking his head. "It's nothing." Richard chuckled. "Maybe. Or maybe it's her." Lucas stilled. The words settled deep, forcing him to see himself, to realize what he hadn't before. He was different. And maybe, just maybe, it had something to do with Isabella. Everyone knows that Lucas had spent his life mastering control. Control over his company, his reputation, his emotions. But lately, he felt that control slipping, not in an obvious, catastrophic way, but in the quiet, unexpected moments. Like the way he lingered in the kitchen longer than necessary, waiting for Isabella to leave her usual note. Or how he caught himself scanning the apartment, wondering where she was when he didn't hear the soft shuffle of her movements. It was unsettling, and yet he didn't hate it. They spent more time together now, not because they had to, but because it felt inevitable. Isabella played the piano in the evenings, and Lucas found himself drawn to the sound, leaning against the doorway, watching her fingers move effortlessly over the keys. One night, without thinking, He stepped into the kitchen and started cooking as she played. It was strange at first, the domesticity of it. He, a man who had spent his life dining in Michelin-starred restaurants, was now carefully plating a meal as Isabella's music filled the air. She noticed. And the next night, when he started cooking again, she played a melody just a little bit longer. Movies were another change. Lucas had always watched films half distracted, checking his phone, responding to emails, barely paying attention. But with Isabella, it was different. She couldn't hear the dialogue, so she relied on subtitles, facial expressions, and details he had never bothered to notice before. So he began reading them too. And soon, he realized he was actually watching. At the charity center, Lucas surprised himself. At first, he had followed Isabella like an outsider, reluctant but willing. Now, he talked to people. He listened to an old man tell stories about his youth. He watched a little girl clutch Isabella's hands, giggling as she learned to sign simple words. He saw the way people lit up around her, how she never hesitated to offer a piece of herself to those who had so little. And somewhere in the blur of these moments, Lucas realized something. This wasn't about his father anymore. It wasn't about the deal, the contract, or the inheritance. He wanted to be here. He wanted to know her. Leave a comment, "Soda, if you're not a skimmer." That evening, when they got home, Isabella curled up on the couch with a book, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the page as she read. She looked tired, peaceful, but lost in thought. Lucas hesitated. Then, without thinking, he sat down beside her. She blinked, surprised, but didn't move away. Slowly, carefully, Lucas lifted his hands. "How was your day?" The signs were a little shaky, a little hesitant, but they were his. Isabella stilled. Her eyes widened, the book slipping from her lap. For a second, she didn't move. Then, her breath caught, and tears welled in her eyes. Lucas panicked. Had he done something wrong? But then, before he could react, she reached for him, and in the next second, she wrapped her arms around him, holding him tight. Lucas froze. She was warm, so much warmer than he had expected. Her shoulders shook slightly against his, and it took him a moment to realize. She was crying. He hesitated. Then slowly, uncertainly, he lifted his arms and hugged her back. And for the first time in his life, Lucas Stark felt something he couldn't explain. Something terrifying. Something real. The apartment felt different, at least since half a year ago. It wasn't a shift he could pinpoint, not something tangible like a rearranged room or a change in the air. It was subtle, a quiet presence that lingered between them, unspoken, but undeniably there. He noticed it in the way silence no longer felt empty. Dinner was no longer just a routine. They ate together, not because they had to, but because neither one seemed to leave the table too quickly. Sometimes they exchanged notes between bites, small thoughts scribbled onto napkins. The habit should have felt ridiculous. It didn't. One evening, passing by the dining table, his gaze caught on the glow of Isabella's laptop screen. A web page filled with images stretched across the display, small hands gripping threadbare toys, wide eyes staring back with quiet curiosity. He paused. The sight of children shouldn't have stirred anything in him, yet for some reason he found himself unable to look away. Isabella didn't notice him at first, absorbed in whatever she was reading. Her fingers rested lightly on the touchpad, scrolling through what he now realized were orphanage records. Brows drawing together, he lowered himself into the chair opposite her. Only then did she glance up, blinking as if surprised by his presence. He nodded toward the screen. "What is this?" Her fingers moved instinctively toward the notepad beside her. "Children from the center," she wrote. "I help sponsor some of them when I can." His jaw tightened slightly. She had never mentioned this before. Not that she owed him an explanation, but it made him wonder. How much more was there about her that he didn't know? She hesitated for a beat before adding another line. "Do you like kids?" For once, he had no quick answer. It was a simple question, yet it lodged in his chest with an unexpected weight. He had never given it much thought, never had a reason to. Lucas Stark wasn't the kind of man who thought about children, and yet, staring at the question, he wasn't sure why the answer suddenly mattered. The shift continued, settling into their daily routine in ways that felt inevitable. He no longer saw her as an obligation, or even as a quiet presence in his home. Somehow, without him realizing it, she had become a part of his life. Evenings that were once spent in separate rooms now unfolded in the same space. She played the piano and he cooked. It started without thought, just something to fill the time. But when she noticed, she began playing longer. Movies were the same. She relied on subtitles to catch the dialogue, so he found himself reading along, actually watching. It was strange, realizing how much he had once overlooked, how much he had ignored. At the charity center, the shift was even more obvious. He didn't just stand in the background anymore. For the first time, he spoke to people and listened to their stories. He watched as Isabella helped a young boy feel the rhythm of music through vibrations, and saw the way she offered warmth without needing words. And somewhere in the middle of it all, a quiet truth settled in. This wasn't about the contract anymore. It wasn't about his father. It wasn't about duty. He was here because he wanted to be. That night, Isabella lingered at the piano longer than usual. From where he stood near the kitchen, he could see the way her fingers hovered over the keys, as if considering something. Then, reaching for a small slip of paper, she slid it across the polished surface toward him. Lucas walked over, picking it up. "This song is for you." His throat tightened. She turned back to the piano, placed her fingers on the keys, and played. It was different from the pieces she usually performed. It wasn't dramatic, wasn't melancholic or overwhelming. It was gentle, slow, full of something warm. It filled the room, not with sound, but with emotion. Lucas felt it more than he heard it, and something inside him broke open. Because in that moment, he knew. He knew that this had never been about an arrangement. He knew that this wasn't about his father's expectations, his inheritance, or even the contract that had brought them together. This was about her, about the way she saw the world in a way he never had, about the way she had quietly, unknowingly, become the only thing he looked forward to each day. Lucas Stark, for the first time in his life, was falling in love. And it was the most terrifying thing he had ever felt. Later that night, when Isabella had gone to bed, Lucas found himself sitting alone in the dark, staring at nothing in particular. 1 year. That was how long they had. And suddenly, that year felt too short. The apartment felt different in a way that neither of them spoke about. It wasn't in the way the furniture sat, or the way the city light stretched across the windows, or even in the way the silence settled between them. It was something unspoken, something woven into the way they moved around each other now, the way Lucas lingered a little longer, the way Isabella's gaze softened when he entered a room. And yet, despite the quiet comfort they had found in each other, there was a countdown neither could ignore. The contract's deadline loomed closer. She had been staring at the calendar all morning. Lucas noticed from across the room, watching as Isabella's fingers hovered over the date, 1/2 a month left. A quiet sigh left her lips before she turned away, rubbing at her temples. The screen of her laptop still glowed beside her, the acceptance letter from Paris Music Academy open. She had never mentioned it to him outright, but he knew. He had seen her researching flights. He had seen the way she looked at her emails when she thought he wasn't paying attention. Paris had always been her dream. Lucas forced himself to swallow the bitterness creeping up his throat. He should be happy for her. Instead, an unfamiliar weight settled in his chest. At work, focus was impossible. The numbers on the spreadsheets blurred together. Conversations became noise, and every time he caught his reflection in the glass walls of his office, all he could see was the past year flashing through his mind. The moment he had signed the contract, he was convinced this was nothing more than a forced obligation. The nights he had spent ignoring her, the first time he had seen her play, the first note she had left beside his coffee, the first time he had signed a word to her, the first time he had felt something shift, and now, suddenly, time had run out. His chest tightened. He had spent years believing that love was a weakness, that attachment made a man vulnerable. But now, as he sat at his desk, unable to think of anything except her, Lucas realized something. He couldn't let her go. The contract had once made him feel like a cage. But now, as the days slipped through his fingers like grains of sand, Lucas realized he no longer wanted to be set free. Isabella must have sensed it too. That evening, she sat at the dining table, a soft pool of golden light illuminating her face. Her hands moved with practiced ease as she wrote something on a slip of paper. Lucas, pouring himself a glass of whiskey, barely glanced at her until she slid the note across the table toward him. He hesitated before picking it up. "Our year is almost over. Are we going to court to sign for divorce?" The words hit harder than they should have. Lucas stared at the note for a long time. He could feel her eyes on him, waiting, not pressuring, just waiting. A deep breath filled his lungs, but it did nothing to steady the weight pressing against his ribs. He reached for the pen. Slowly, carefully, he crossed out the word divorce. Then beneath it, he wrote two new words: lifetime contract. Silence stretched between them. Isabella's breath caught. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came, not even written ones. Lucas didn't need her to say anything. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, flipping it open with quiet certainty. Inside, nestled in the soft fabric, was a simple but elegant ring. Nothing extravagant, nothing designed to impress. It was her, understated, graceful, timeless. His throat tightened, but his hands were steady as he lifted them, signing with clarity. "Stay with me." Isabella's fingers trembled as she lifted her hands. Then, with tears welling in her eyes, she signed back. "Yes." And Lucas Stark, a man who had spent his life drowning in noise, finally understood what it meant to hear without a single sound. Richard stared at them for a long moment, his hands clasped together on the desk. The weight of his gaze settled heavily between them, flickering between Lucas and Isabella with an unreadable expression. Then, without warning, he exhaled a short laugh, shaking his head. "I can't say I saw this coming," he admitted, leaning back in his chair. "But I have to say, I'm relieved." Lucas arched an eyebrow. Relieved? Richard's gaze softened. "I had hoped you'd change, son. I just never expected you to change because of her." Lucas glanced at Isabella. She met his gaze, her lips curling in a small, knowing smile. There was no denying it anymore. He wasn't the same man who had signed that contract a year ago. But as much as Richard's approval mattered, there was still one last truth to face. Isabella's fingers brushed over the plane ticket resting on the table between them. Paris. Lucas saw the hesitation in her movements, the weight of the choice pressing against her shoulders. She had spent her life dreaming about this. He had known it long before she ever mentioned it, long before he had ever cared. She deserved this. And as much as he wanted to hold on to her, he knew he couldn't be selfish. Lucas lifted his hands and signed, "You should go." Isabella's lips parted slightly, as if the confirmation, his permission, his support, had surprised her. He leaned forward, taking her hand in his. The warmth of her skin against his own was grounding, steadying. "I'll wait for you," he signed. Her fingers tightened around his. She didn't need to ask if he meant it. The next 2 years passed in a rhythm neither of them expected. At first, the distance was strange and unfamiliar. The apartment felt emptier without Isabella's quiet presence, without the soft notes of her music drifting through the air. Lucas found himself reaching for his phone more often, checking the clock, wondering what time it was in Paris. But they found a way. They wrote letters, not emails, not texts, handwritten letters. Lucas had never been the kind of man to spill his thoughts onto paper, but with Isabella, it felt natural. He would write about his days, about the new things he was learning, and about the moments he caught himself missing her more than he should, and she wrote back. Her letters were filled with details about her classes, about the professors who pushed her beyond what she thought possible, and about the way she could feel the history of the academy in the vibrations beneath her fingertips. Lucas visited whenever he could. Their time together was fleeting, but never wasted. He would sit beside her while she played, and she would listen as he signed stories about his work, about the company, and about how much he hated going home to an empty apartment. But in the moments between those visits, Lucas found himself changed in other ways. The charity center became his second home. It had started small, continuing the work Isabella had done, ensuring the program she had built remained intact. But before long, it became more than just a duty. Lucas found himself returning week after week. He helped organize fundraisers. He met with the children Isabella had once taught, listening to them with a patience he hadn't known he possessed. And slowly, his name started meaning something different in New York. Lucas Stark, the billionaire heir, wasn't just a ruthless businessman anymore. He was a man who built something beyond profit. And all of it, every change, every step forward, was because of her. 2 years later, Lucas stood at the airport, his hands in his pockets, heart hammering against his ribs. He had spent so much time waiting for this moment, so much time imagining what it would feel like to see her again, to have her back in his world. Today is that day. Lucas, New York, and their love are waiting for her. The arrival board flashed. Flight from Paris, landed, his breath caught. And then, there she was. Isabella stepped through the gate, suitcase rolling behind her, her hair slightly tousled from the long flight. She scanned the crowd, brow furrowing for a second, until her eyes met his. For a beat, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, she smiled. And Lucas Stark, a man who had once believed love was nothing more than a distraction, crossed the distance between them without hesitation. The first morning at Stark Academy of Music, the classroom was filled with nervous excitement. Children, some holding their parents' hands tightly, others clutching the straps of their backpacks, shuffled into the space. Some were wide-eyed with curiosity, while others kept their gazes fixed on the floor, unsure of what to expect. Lucas stood near the entrance, watching the room take shape. The space had been carefully designed, walls painted in warm, inviting colors, shelves lined with musical instruments of all kinds. Several pianos stood against one wall, their polished surfaces reflecting the morning light. And at the heart of it all, Isabella. She sat on a low stool in front of a group of children, a small keyboard placed between her and them. Her hands moved fluidly, signing while she spoke in soft, encouraging expressions. A young girl, no older than 7, sat closest to her, watching every motion with wide, fascinated eyes. Isabella tapped gently on the keys, then gestured toward the girl's hands. "Your turn." The girl hesitated. Then, slowly, she mimicked the movement. The sound rang out, a single note, soft and uncertain, but full of potential. Isabella smiled. Lucas watched as she guided each child not with sound, but with sensation. She encouraged them to place their hands flat against the piano surface, letting them feel the vibration each note produced. A young boy, hesitant at first, pressed down a key and gasped when he felt the faint tremor beneath his fingertips. His eyes darted up to Isabella, his expression filled with wonder. She nodded, her fingers signing slowly. Music is not just something you hear. It is something you feel. The boy's lips curved into a small smile. Lucas had never imagined himself in a classroom, let alone one filled with children. But over the next few weeks, he found himself drawn into their world. He handled the operations, the scheduling, the funding, the logistics. But more and more, he found himself sitting beside Isabella during lessons, absorbing the way she taught. One afternoon, he watched as she introduced a young boy named Ethan to the piano. Ethan had been born deaf and had never considered playing an instrument before. Isabella placed one of his hands against the wooden surface of the piano and tapped a key with the other. She motioned for him to close his eyes. At first, he hesitated. Then, reluctantly, he let them drift shut. Isabella played a few notes, watching him carefully. A beat. Then, his fingers twitched. She pressed another key, slower this time, and then, the smallest, most beautiful thing happened. Ethan's face changed, his brows furrowed, his lips parted slightly. He could feel it. Lucas caught himself holding his breath. Then slowly, Isabella guided his hands over the keys, allowing him to press them himself. The moment the vibrations buzzed against his skin, Ethan smiled, and Lucas felt something tighten in his chest. This was why they had built this. Their school wasn't just about teaching music. It was about creating a space where sound was not the only language. Some children learned to play by feeling the rhythm through the floorboards. Others placed their hands against the body of a violin to experience the hum of the strings. Lucas, always the businessman, had been skeptical about some of the techniques at first. But as he watched the children come alive, watched their confidence bloom under Isabella's patient guidance, he realized she had been right about all of it. And he had never been so happy to be wrong. Evenings at the academy were quieter. After the students had gone home, Isabella and Lucas would often linger, tidying up, preparing for the next day. One night, after an especially long class, Isabella leaned against the piano, stretching her arms. Lucas handed her a bottle of water, watching as she took a sip before setting it down. "You're incredible at this," he signed. She raised an eyebrow. "At teaching?" He shook his head. "At changing lives." Her expression softened, her hands stilling for a moment before she signed back. "So are you." Lucas exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. He had spent most of his life believing his worth was measured in profit margins and business acquisitions. But here, in this little school, in this little world they had built together, he had found something far more valuable. He had found purpose. Back at home, their world was simple but full. They cooked together, moving in sync around the kitchen like they had been doing it for years. They watched movies, laughing at subtitles that sometimes translated things incorrectly. They sat on the balcony at night, fingers moving in the air, communicating without a single sound. Lucas had finally learned to listen. And Isabella, after years of moving through a world that rarely took the time to understand her, had finally found someone who did. One evening, as the city lights stretched endlessly before them, Isabella rested her head against Lucas's shoulder. He turned toward her, lifted his hands, and signed two simple words. "Are you happy?" She didn't hesitate. Her fingers moved fluidly, effortlessly. "Always." Then, she reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his, and in the quiet that followed, they understood each other completely. No words needed. They had always been speaking the same language. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. And if you enjoyed this story, please share it with your friends on WhatsApp. And now, share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.